I rented a small, cheap townhouse on the outskirts of Scarborough, mostly because it was affordable and close enough to my work. The building was old, with peeling paint on the front door and a faint smell of damp that clung to the hallway. The floors creaked with every step, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear the neighbors moving around or flushing toilets. I didn't mind too much, it was cheap, and I wasn't planning to stay long. From the moment I moved in, I noticed the basement. The stairs leading down were narrow and steep, the kind that made you hold onto the railing for balance. At the bottom, there was a small storage room with a heavy metal door and a rusty lock. The landlord specifically told me not to use it. He didn't explain why, just said it was off limits. I assumed it held old pipes, maybe some electrical equipment, or remnants of previous tenants. I didn't think much of it and didn't bother with it. Winter had set in hard, and the nights were long and cold. I would come home late from work, usually after dark, and the house felt colder than the weather outside. I kept the heat on, but the basement always seemed untouched by warmth. The air was damp and carried a faint metallic smell, the kind you notice when a place hasn't been used in years. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. The house was quiet, as usual, but there was something different. A faint tapping sound came from the basement, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought it might be the pipes, settling or freezing in the cold, but the rhythm was too intentional, too precise. It wasn't random creaking or dripping water. The tapping kept repeating, with a pause between each strike, almost like someone was counting or tapping lightly with a finger. I stayed in bed, my heart pounding, listening. The tapping came from the direction of that small storage room. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a rat, maybe some piece of old equipment shaking in the pipes. Still, the rational side of me didn't stop the fear that grew with every tap. After a few minutes, curiosity mixed with fear became unbearable. I grabbed my phone for light and slowly made my way to the basement door. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step louder than it should have been. My hand shook as I pressed the flashlight on. The beam cut through the darkness of the basement, illuminating the old shelves stacked with dusty boxes and some old furniture pushed against the walls. I froze when I reached the storage room door. The tapping had stopped. Silence filled the basement, so complete it made me jump at every small noise. The hum of the heater, the wind against the windows, the faint drip of water somewhere in the corner. I crouched down to look under the door, shining the flashlight through the narrow gap at the bottom. My stomach sank when I saw it. A shoe. One shoe, resting on its side, the way it would look if someone was sitting on the other side of the door. My mind raced. There was no way anyone should be there. The door was locked from the inside, and the landlord had assured me no one else had access to this basement. I stared at the shoe for a long moment. Then I heard it breathing. Slow, steady, deliberate. It wasn't coming through the walls. It was coming from behind the door, right there in the storage room. My heart slammed in my chest. Every rational thought screamed at me to run, but my legs felt frozen. The sound of the breathing was soft but unmistakable, steady enough that I could tell someone was sitting or crouching just out of sight. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the bottom step, and ran upstairs. I didn't look back, didn't pause to think. My hands fumbled as I turned on every light in the house, the fluorescent hum of the kitchen and living room lights barely calming the raw panic coursing through me. I grabbed my bag, my coat, my keys, and started throwing things inside, my mind racing with 1,000 worst-case scenarios. I couldn't call the police, not yet. I didn't know if anyone could get in the house from outside. Maybe the landlord had lied about it being locked. Maybe there was a way someone had gotten inside without me knowing. I could hear my own breathing, loud and ragged, my heart hammering in my ears as I stuffed clothes into the bag. The house felt wrong. Every shadow in the corner of the room looked like movement. Every small sound made me jump. I ran through the townhouse one last time, checking the doors and windows, making sure I wasn't missing anything. The basement stayed quiet, but I couldn't bring myself to look back at the storage room. I didn't care about what could be in there. I just wanted to get out. I drove away that night, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't stop to eat. I just kept driving, keeping my eyes glued to the road ahead. The streetlights flickered past, and I noticed the cold winter air pressing against the windows, the way the fog of my breath settled inside the car. Every time I thought I might calm down, I pictured that shoe lying sideways behind the door and that slow, deliberate breathing. By the time I reached a motel several miles away, I could finally let myself relax a little, though sleep was impossible. I sat in the cheap room, double-locked the door, and stared at the pale glow of the streetlight coming through the curtains. I didn't turn on the TV, didn't try to distract myself. I just sat wide awake, imagining that basement and what could have been hiding behind that locked door. The next morning, I packed the rest of my things. I didn't stop to look around the townhouse. I didn't leave a note or even tell the landlord I was leaving. I paid the last month's rent in cash, stuffed my bag in the car, and drove off, taking every item I owned with me. I didn't look back. I never went back to that townhouse. I never called to ask what was in that storage room, and I never spoke to the landlord again. The thought of that basement, that small locked room, and the slow, intentional tapping haunted me for weeks. Even now, months later, I get chills thinking about it. I don't know if anyone was living down there, or if someone had found a way in without me knowing. But I learned one thing clearly. Some doors are locked for a reason, and some rules, no matter how inconvenient, are worth following. I finally settled into a new place, one that felt safe, one with a basement I didn't need to think about. I keep the lights on at night and avoid quiet, empty rooms. I tell myself it's over, but every time I hear a faint tapping somewhere in an old building, or even in my own apartment, I feel the memory of that night in Scarborough creeping back. It's not a story I tell often, and it's not something I ever want to experience again, because there's a part of me that knows some things are real, and some dangers don't need explanation to be terrifying. That townhouse, that basement, and that small locked storage room with the shoe sideways on the floor taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some sounds, no matter how quiet, are worth running from. I left Scarborough that night and never returned, and I made sure that whatever was in that basement stayed there, behind that lock, far away from me. I didn't need proof, I didn't need understanding. I just needed to be gone, and that's exactly what I did. The memory is still sharp, still makes my stomach turn, and I know I'll carry it with me forever. I'll never forget the slow tapping, the sudden silence, or the sound of breathing coming from a place that was supposed to be empty. That townhouse is just a building now, but for me, it's a reminder that some fears aren't imaginary, some spaces aren't meant to be explored, and some nights, no amount of logic or explanation can make you feel safe. I never went back, and I never will. I had just moved into a small, older house that had been on the market for a while. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I was excited to settle in. The basement was typical for a house of its age. Low ceilings, concrete floors with cracks in places, and dim, dusty corners that smelled faintly of mildew. Against one wall stood an old deep freezer, large, white, and heavy, its exterior scratched and yellowed with age. It was unplugged, and when I opened it, it was empty. The previous tenants must have left it behind. I didn't think much of it and left it there, assuming it was just a forgotten appliance that had outlived its usefulness. At first, the basement was quiet, silent except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator upstairs or the creaking of the house settling. I didn't spend much time down there except to store boxes and clean a bit. The freezer remained shut, unconnected, forgotten in the corner, as if it were just part of the concrete wall it leaned against. A few weeks after moving in, one night I was heading downstairs to grab a box of tools I had left there. It was late, the house completely silent, and the air in the basement was cooler than the upper floors, a damp, heavy cool that made my breath slightly visible. As I walked past the freezer, I thought I heard a faint rattling, like ice shifting inside. I froze and listened. There it was again, a soft, uneven rattle, followed by a slight thunk. My first thought was that it was impossible. This freezer was unplugged. Nothing could be moving inside. Nothing could make frost appear inside an unpowered freezer. I shook my head, tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the settling of the old metal, or perhaps the pipes somewhere in the walls. But the sound pulled me closer. I opened the freezer slowly, my hands trembling slightly, and shined the flashlight from my phone into the interior. The inside was now coated with frost. Not just a little moisture or a few frost streaks like you might expect in a fridge left in a cold basement. It was thick, uneven frost covering every surface. I stepped back instinctively. How was this possible? The freezer had been unplugged the entire time. I leaned in closer and then froze completely. Written in the frost, as if someone had drawn it with a finger, were the letters, "Don't." The letters were jagged, deliberate, almost perfectly formed in their unevenness. I slammed the freezer shut, my heart hammering in my chest, and taped the edges with packing tape, pressing it as firmly as I could to avoid it opening again. I told myself it was probably some kind of frost pattern forming naturally, an illusion, or maybe I had noticed smudges I hadn't seen before. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the handwriting was far too deliberate. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the frost, the letters, the deliberate strokes. The next day I went to check the freezer again, in the cold light of morning. I opened it slowly. The frost was gone, but I noticed something else. Inside the freezer, on the metal bottom, were small scratches. They weren't deep, but they looked deliberate, like someone had scraped the metal with their fingernails. My stomach turned. I wiped them with a cloth, cleaned the frost, and tried to convince myself it was a one-time anomaly, something left by the previous tenants that had reacted to the cold basement air. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I felt a tight knot in my chest. Over the next week, I avoided the basement as much as possible. Boxes and storage cluttered the main floor, but I had no choice sometimes but to go down there. Each time I passed the freezer, I noticed subtle things. A faint smell, metallic and cold, would sometimes hang around the corner where it stood. Dust had shifted slightly on top of it, as if someone had brushed against it, and the rattling continued, though now it was faint, irregular, almost like the metal itself was quietly moving. I started documenting everything. I took pictures of the frost, of the letters, of the scratches. I noted the times I heard the rattling. I checked the temperature and humidity in the basement, measured air currents, anything that might explain it. Nothing made sense. There was no power running to the freezer. The basement temperature was steady. There was no moisture coming in through the walls or the floor. Everything suggested the frost should not have formed, the letters should not have appeared, and the rattling should not have been happening. One night, a week later, I had to go down to retrieve a box I had stored. I turned the basement light on, the bulb casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor. I walked past the freezer, hesitant, and reached for the handle. The rattling began again immediately, louder this time, uneven, like something heavy being pushed against the walls of the freezer. I swallowed hard and opened it. Inside, the frost had returned, thicker than before, and the letters had changed slightly. This time they read, "Leave." My hands shook violently as I shut it again, and taped it even more securely than before, wrapping the freezer with several layers of tape, pressing it firmly against the floor so it couldn't move. The next morning, I decided I couldn't leave it in the basement. It was too disturbing, too unpredictable. I arranged for a professional to remove it. The movers came, old, careful, and loaded the freezer into the truck. I watched from the top of the stairs, keeping my distance, feeling the basement seem to exhale as it lost the heavy presence of the appliance. Once the freezer was gone, I spent hours cleaning the area, scrubbing the floor, mopping up residual frost, and airing the basement out. After that, the rattling stopped completely. The smell disappeared. The basement felt normal again. I didn't hear any strange sounds, see frost, or find any scratches. It was just a basement again, cold, concrete, and empty. Over time, the memory of those nights felt like a bad dream, though the images of the frost and the letters stayed in my mind. I never found out why it happened. No electrical anomaly, no hidden compartments, nothing explained the frost forming in an unplugged freezer, or the deliberate words appearing on its walls. Whatever it was gone once the freezer was removed and the basement returned to normal. I continued living there, and eventually I felt safe again. I told myself some things are better left unexplained, and that I had done everything I could to remove the source. The basement, once heavy and tense, was now just another storage space, quiet and unremarkable. And for the first time in weeks, I could go down there without that sense of dread pressing on my chest. It wasn't perfect, it would never feel completely normal again, but I had cleared the strange presence, dealt with the source, and finally regained control of my own space. The house felt like mine again, and that alone was enough to let me sleep at night. I had always disliked the basement in my townhouse. It wasn't dark in a spooky way, and it wasn't unusually large, but there was something about it that never felt right. The concrete floor was cold and rough underfoot, and the walls were bare except for the faint stains from years of moisture seeping through. There was a strange smell that I had ignored for months, a metallic, almost coppery odor that seemed strongest near the drain in the corner. I assumed it was rusted plumbing. That's the only explanation that made sense to me. I had lived in older houses before. Plumbing smells weren't unusual. I never thought to worry too much. The drain was an old, circular metal fixture set into the concrete, not much bigger than a dinner plate. Water sometimes pooled around it after heavy rains, or when I washed the floor, and it always smelled sharp, chemical, metallic. I tried cleaning it a few times with a brush, but the smell never went away. One weekend, I decided to give it a proper cleaning. I had gloves on, a small bucket, and some basic tools. I unscrewed the drain cap carefully, expecting the usual sludge of dust, hair, and soap residue that any old basement drain collects. When I lifted the cap, the smell hit me all at once, stronger and more sour than I had ever noticed. It made my stomach turn. Underneath, the water wasn't clear. It had a brownish tint, murky enough that I couldn't see the bottom of the pipe. My first instinct was to reach in with my hand, but I quickly stopped myself. I grabbed a pair of pliers from my toolbox instead, trying to fish out whatever was causing the obstruction. That's when I felt it, a soft, soggy mass wedged tightly into the drain. I pulled it out slowly, my stomach knotting tighter with every inch. When it finally came free, I froze. It was a small t-shirt, the size of a child. It was drenched, stiff with something in the water, clinging to itself in a way that made it impossible to ignore what it had been sitting in. I dropped it immediately, almost gagging. The water underneath the shirt was more brown than I had expected, streaked with darker patches that caught the dim basement light. My hands shook. I wanted to step back, but I couldn't. The sight was wrong in every sense, and I felt a weight pressing on my chest that had nothing to do with the physical effort of pulling the shirt out. I called emergency services, trying to keep my voice calm, explaining what I found in the drain. When they arrived, the officers and responders treated it like a plumbing complaint. They checked the drain, looked at the pipes, and ran some basic tests on the water, but nobody could explain the shirt or the discoloration. They kept asking if I had any children, if anyone had access to the basement, and if there were pets. Every answer I gave was negative. They seemed more puzzled than concerned, and after a while they left, leaving me alone in the basement with the smell still lingering in the corners. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I cleaned the basement thoroughly, bleach in every corner, and even tried some industrial cleaners on the drain. The metallic smell didn't go away completely, though. It hovered in the air, faint but persistent. I checked the pipes, tapping and listening for anything unusual. There was no blockage, nothing that could explain the brown water. I even called a private plumber to take a second look. He was careful, professional, but he shrugged after an hour, saying the plumbing seemed normal. He couldn't explain the t-shirt either. I tried to push it out of my mind, but every time I went down to the basement, I felt uneasy. The air seemed heavier, the corners darker than they should have been. I would sometimes catch a glint of something in the drain and jump, thinking it was the shirt again, though it was always just reflections on the metal. I avoided touching the drain. I started covering it with a small plastic grate, just to keep it out of sight, and I made myself stop thinking about the water. Weeks later, I started noticing small changes in the basement. Nothing obvious at first, just little things. A faint wet spot near the drain, the smell slightly stronger at times, like it was surfacing in the air even when everything seemed dry. I checked the water again, letting it run into the drain, and it seemed clear. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about that t-shirt had marked the place. I started keeping my tools and cleaning supplies upstairs, trying not to go down more than necessary. I eventually called a professional cleaner to come and sanitize the basement, someone with industrial equipment. They brought fans, heavy-duty chemicals, and large brushes. They scrubbed every inch of concrete, every wall, even the corners of the ceiling. They cleaned the drain thoroughly, removed all the pipes they could access, and ran chemicals down to make sure there was no bacterial growth. The smell diminished after their work, though it never went completely away. I still noticed it sometimes when the air was damp, or when the heat hit the concrete floor. It was like a faint shadow of that first metallic smell. After that, life slowly returned to normal. I started using the basement again for storage, though I kept it minimal, nothing touching the drain. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I realized nobody could. There were no missing persons reports that connected, no evidence of anything beyond an old, forgotten t-shirt flushed down some old pipes. It was terrifying because it was entirely plausible. Something had ended up in that drain for reasons I would never know. A mistake, an accident, or something far worse, it didn't matter. I couldn't change it. The basement never felt welcoming, but it no longer made me anxious every time I went down. I accepted that some things were beyond explanation. I made sure the drain was sealed and added a trap cover to prevent anything else from going down. I also installed a small sensor that could detect moisture and unusual odors, giving me some control over the unknown elements. Over time, I realized the basement wasn't dangerous because of anything supernatural. The danger, the fear, had been entirely human. Whatever had placed that t-shirt there had created a trace that I stumbled upon. The reality of it, the fact that the water and the fabric existed without explanation, was enough. I couldn't investigate further, I couldn't find closure, but I could protect myself. I kept my distance from the drain, I kept my basement clean, and I never left anything unattended near it. Eventually, the house felt like mine again. The metallic smell faded to almost nothing, the concrete floor was scrubbed clean, and the drain was sealed. I learned that fear could live in ordinary places, and that sometimes the scariest things are not obvious. They are silent, subtle, lingering in the corners of a basement, in the smell of water, in the small details that the human eye can almost miss. The experience left a mark on me, but it didn't control me. I reclaimed the space, and while I would never forget that t-shirt, I understood that life sometimes gives you mysteries you cannot solve, and the only thing you can do is respond sensibly, carefully, and move on. The basement, once a source of dread, became just a basement again. The floor was swept, boxes neatly stacked, and the air finally felt normal. I never touched that drain cap without gloves again, and I never went down there alone at night. But I also never lived in fear. The metallic smell became nothing more than a faint memory, a warning that life is full of strange traces left behind, and that sometimes the world's mysteries are real, but not unsolvable. They are just part of ordinary life, in the most unsettling way possible. In the end, I accepted that some questions would remain unanswered. I did what I could, cleaned, sealed, monitored, and then I let it go. The basement had its story, and I had mine. I moved forward knowing that being careful, vigilant, and aware of small details was enough to reclaim ordinary spaces from extraordinary unease. The house, the basement, the drain, they were all just part of life now, quiet and harmless, as long as I respected the unknown and left it alone. The metallic smell never returned fully, and the basement never scared me again. I learned how much control a person really has, even in situations that seem inexplicably disturbing. The shirt, the brown water, the odor, they stayed a memory, a sharp reminder of how fragile our sense of normalcy can be. But the house was mine, the basement safe, and I could finally rest without that heavy weight pressing on my chest every time I stepped down the stairs. It took time, but I recovered my sense of security. The basement's secret would remain unknown, but I no longer needed to know. I had done everything I could. I had faced it, acted responsibly, and survived the unease. And that, I realized, was enough. I moved into the house a little over a year ago. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest two-story with a basement that felt typical for an older home. The floors were concrete, the walls a dull gray, with the usual smell of dampness that basements always seem to have. Nothing about it stood out at first, except that one corner. One corner of the basement floor wasn't smooth like the rest. Someone had patched it, maybe to fix a crack, but it wasn't even with the rest of the floor. It was slightly raised, uneven, and the concrete looked newer than everything else. I didn't think much of it at the time. Uneven concrete isn't uncommon. I walked past it 1,000 times without noticing anything else. It started slowly. The first night I really noticed something. It was just after 3 in the morning. I woke up to the sound of a dull thud. I thought maybe it was settling, or my mind playing tricks on me. Then I heard it again. Thud, drag, thud. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like something heavy being pushed across the floor. I froze. The sound came from the basement. I live alone. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I told myself it was probably just a pipe or some weird house noise. The next night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch with the lights off, straining my ears. I didn't hear anything at first, but when the clock hit 3:02, it started again. Thud, drag, thud. It was coming from that corner, the uneven patch. I couldn't see anything, and I didn't want to turn on a light and break the quiet, so I grabbed my phone and hit record. I left it running for almost 10 minutes, listening to the dragging and thudding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. When it stopped, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The next day, I played the recording. I put it on my laptop, turned the volume all the way up, and filtered out the static. That's when I heard it. A faint, desperate voice underneath the dragging. It said, "Help." Just once, barely audible, but clear when I focused on it. I stared at the screen in disbelief. I rewound it, listened again. Yes, it was there. I couldn't explain it. I've always been skeptical. I don't believe in the supernatural. I've never been the type to imagine things. I know what I heard. I called the police. I explained everything, the thudding, the dragging, the voice. They sent 2 officers. They brought tools to scan the floor. They tapped the concrete, measured everything, checked for holes or hidden spaces. They found nothing. The floor was solid. The patch was just an old repair, nothing hollow underneath. They even sent someone to check the foundation from outside. No hidden crawl space, no hollow cavities. The officers looked at me like I was wasting their time, but I wasn't imagining it. I knew what I heard. After that, I started sleeping with earplugs. It helped at first. I didn't hear the sound every night, but it came back unpredictably. Always after 3. Sometimes it would be just a single thud, sometimes the full drag sequence. Every time, I would wake up in a panic, heart pounding. I never stayed to watch it happen again. I'd pull the blankets over my head and wait until it stopped. I tried everything. I brought in a professional sound engineer to record the basement. I left cameras running. Nothing showed movement. Nothing moved on the cameras. Yet, when I played the audio, there was always something. The thud, the drag, faint under it, barely there, the voice saying help. Sometimes I thought maybe it was a prank, like someone was hiding somewhere and recording me. But the house is isolated, the basement is locked, there's no way anyone could have been in there. And the voice wasn't distorted. It sounded human. Weak, tired, scared. Eventually, I started spending less time in the house. I avoided the basement completely. I stopped going down to grab laundry at night. I left lights on in the living room, so I wouldn't have to go anywhere near it after dark. I even considered moving, but everything else about the house was fine, and I hated the idea of leaving without answers. The thudding would sometimes happen during the day, faintly, but mostly it waited for 3 in the morning. Like it had a schedule. Months passed. I became numb to the fear. I accepted it as part of life, a strange, unexplainable thing that belonged to the house. But then one day I noticed something. I had been staring at the patch, thinking about it as I often did, and I realized there was a small crack along the edge, almost invisible unless you looked close. I didn't touch it at first, just stared. The crack ran along the uneven concrete, almost like a seam. I got a flashlight and knelt down. There was a small gap, maybe an inch wide. Not enough for a person to fit through, but enough for something small to hide, maybe. I got a crowbar. I carefully chipped away at the edge, slowly, not wanting to damage the rest of the floor. After an hour, I had lifted the corner enough to see underneath. There was a cavity, not big, maybe a foot deep and a couple of feet long, just enough for a box or a small container. Inside was old, torn cardboard, dusty and decayed. I dug deeper with my hands. That's when I found it. A small, worn recording device, one of those old tape recorders. Someone had hidden it there. The tape inside was still intact. I played it. It wasn't me imagining things. The tape had the sounds I'd been hearing. The thud, the drag, and the voice, recorded and layered over. Someone had made the noise intentionally. Someone had been recording a voice saying help, and the dragging was fake, created by moving something heavy across the floor over and over. It was a setup, a prank, or maybe something meant to scare whoever lived here. I don't know why. Whoever did it had access to the basement and knew exactly when I would hear it. The house itself had nothing strange about it. I removed the device, destroyed it, and filled the cavity with concrete. I double-checked the basement, taped over the patch completely, and never went near it after dark again. The sound stopped. The voice was gone. I sleep normally now. I still think about it sometimes, about how someone went to the trouble of planting that device, how meticulous they were. It was terrifying, but it wasn't supernatural. It was real, human, calculated, and that made it worse. Now, when I walk past that corner of the basement, I see nothing but concrete. But I remember. I remember the thud, the drag, the faint voice asking for help, and I remember the relief when I finally understood what it was. Nothing hidden under the floor. Nothing alive. Just a person's plan left behind. I don't go down at 3 anymore, and I sleep easy. The house is quiet. It's just a house, finally, just a house with concrete floors and one patched corner, nothing more. I had been working on renovating our basement for weeks. It was one of those old houses where the basement felt more like a dark cave than part of a home, with low ceilings and concrete walls that were cold to the touch. The original plan was simple: remove the old paneling, fix the uneven concrete floor, patch cracks in the walls, and add better lighting. I had bought some cheap LED fixtures, a few gallons of paint, and a new set of shelves to organize tools and supplies. Most of the time, I was alone down there moving furniture, mixing paint, and hammering things together, and I didn't mind it. It was just a project. But one evening, something happened that made me stop in my tracks. I was crawling around on the floor, patching a crack with a concrete filler, when I noticed the Wi-Fi icon on my phone showing full bars. That alone didn't seem too strange at first, but the truth was that our router upstairs barely reached the basement at all. Normally, I had to sit at the top of the stairs just to get a decent signal, and the basement corners were dead zones. The idea of full bars in the middle of the floor made me frown. I set down the trowel and pulled up the network settings on my phone to check. There it was, sitting at the top of the list like it belonged there. B1 camera, unit, marked as active. I stared at it for a long time, scrolling through all the other devices connected to the network, thinking I might be imagining things. But the device was real. I had never installed any kind of camera, smart device, or sensor anywhere in the basement. My wife hadn't either, and we didn't have any contractors working in the house recently. The location tag on the network settings said it was coming from inside the basement. I sat there on the floor, heart starting to pound, looking around. The basement was empty. Well, mostly. There were old shelves, some boxes stacked along one wall, a water heater, a furnace, and a few scattered tools. I moved closer to each wall, inspecting for anything out of place. The concrete walls were bare, except for the cracks I had been patching, and the shelves had nothing unusual on them. There were no wires, no cameras, no small devices hidden in corners or behind boxes. I even checked the ceiling and the corners of the floor where shadows pooled. Nothing. I felt a creeping sense of unease as I walked through the space. My mind started running through possibilities. Could it have been some kind of smart home device I forgot about? A forgotten security system? But I had checked everything before, and nothing matched that name. My stomach tightened. Whoever had put a camera there would have had to hide it perfectly, and it would have had to connect to the Wi-Fi without leaving any visible trace. I thought about the times I had been down there alone. Every evening, sweating, bending over the floor, mixing paint. Did someone watch me? It made my skin crawl. I decided to be careful and not move too much yet. I went back to my phone and refreshed the network settings. The device was still there, active, connected. I scrolled through more options, trying to see if it had any control panel or open ports I could detect, anything that could help me identify where it was. Nothing. It was just sitting there, a signal coming from somewhere in the basement, with no physical trace I could see. The next thing I tried was simple, but nerve-wracking. I shut off the power to the entire house. I flipped the main breaker and felt the lights die across every room. The basement went completely dark, the only light coming from the tiny glow of my phone. I refreshed the network list immediately. The B1 camera unit had disappeared. No trace. Nothing. It was gone like it had never been there. I felt a mix of relief and fear. The relief came from the immediate disappearance, but the fear didn't leave me. It had been real. I had seen it, and I still didn't know where it had been hiding. After that night, I spent hours combing the basement, looking for anything that could explain it. I checked behind the shelves again, removed panels of drywall, even examined the furnace and water heater closely. I opened every vent and cavity I could reach. Still nothing. Not a single piece of equipment, wire, or device. It was impossible. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something, that it could have been tiny, hidden inside some gap or recess I couldn't see. I even crawled into the crawl space that ran under one part of the basement, flashlight in hand. Nothing. Just dirt, pipes, and the echo of my own breathing. The following days were tense. Every time I went into the basement, I felt like I was being watched. I would check my phone obsessively for Wi-Fi signals, scanning for the B1 camera unit. But it never appeared again. I installed additional lighting, rearranged boxes, and even put motion sensor cameras in the corners of the basement. Not because I thought it was a ghost or anything supernatural, but because I wanted to know for sure if someone had secretly entered the house. The cameras never recorded any movement. There was no sign of forced entry or tampering with the network from outside. Eventually, I called a professional network technician to inspect the system. He ran a scan of the router logs, checked the settings, and looked for any unknown devices connected to the network. He found nothing. According to him, There was no evidence of a camera, no connected device by that name, no unusual traffic. He said the only explanation might have been a temporary network glitch, but even he admitted that it was extremely unlikely for a device to appear as active in the middle of the basement without leaving any trace. I started thinking about every angle. Could it have been a neighbor? Someone with a drone, some advanced device that could connect through walls? I ruled most of that out too. Our walls are concrete and thick, the kind that block signals, and I live in a quiet residential area where no one would reasonably hover a drone over my house at night. It didn't make sense, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that whatever it was, it had been able to hide in plain sight in a place I spent hours working every day. After weeks of tension, I made a decision. I couldn't leave it to chance. I installed a proper drop ceiling, sealed every visible gap in the walls, and added protective covers over the utility areas. I reinforced the wiring and routers so that any new device trying to connect would trigger an alert immediately. I spent extra time organizing the basement so that nothing could be hidden, nothing could fit in unnoticed. I checked every box and corner multiple times, making sure the basement was completely under my control. Eventually, life returned to normal. The sense of unease lessened, and I continued the renovation work without incident. I painted, installed shelves, organized tools, and finally finished the basement. I now have a clean, well-lit space with no dark corners, and I keep my phone handy whenever I go down there. I never saw the B1 camera unit again, and I still don't know where it came from or how it connected to the network. I've realized that part of the horror wasn't the device itself, but the knowledge that someone somewhere could have been watching me without my awareness. The feeling of being completely exposed in a place I thought was private was far worse than any physical threat. The basement is safe now, or as safe as it can be, and the renovations made it comfortable to work in, but I never stop checking my phone when I go down there. The memory of seeing full Wi-Fi bars in the dead zone, and a mysterious device connected from a hidden corner I never found, stays with me. It's a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones you can't see or explain, and even when you think you've solved the problem, you might never really know what was there. The important thing is that I took control, reinforced the space, and made sure that if anything like that ever happened again, I would know about it immediately. The basement is mine, the space is secure, and while the memory lingers, it no longer controls me. I finished what I started, turned the basement into a functional part of my home, and finally felt a sense of closure. The strange device may have disappeared, but I'm confident that I won't be caught off guard again. The heat wave had been relentless all week, and the power going out made the house feel like a furnace. Fans that had been spinning tirelessly fell silent, and the kitchen fridge hummed into stillness. I had my phone in hand, using the flashlight to navigate the thick darkness of the basement, which was always a little unsettling even in daylight. The inverter covered some of the main rooms upstairs, but the basement lights were completely out, leaving the concrete stairs, the old support beams, and the scattered boxes barely visible. I could feel the stickiness of sweat on my back and the heat radiating from the walls as I made my way down. The basement had always been cluttered. Shelves lined the far walls, stacked with jars of old screws, dusty paint cans, and other tools that rarely got used. There were cardboard boxes, some labeled, some not, piled in haphazard towers along one side, creating shadowed corridors. I had moved some boxes before when looking for the fuse box, but tonight, the darkness made everything feel different, almost heavier. I could hear the low hum of the house settling, the occasional creak of wood, and the faint buzz of flies trapped somewhere near the old windows at the top of the walls. It felt oppressive, the kind of heat and darkness that made time slow down. I had already found the fuse box once, but tonight, I needed to check it more carefully. The flashlight in my hand was the only thing keeping the basement from swallowing me whole. I turned toward the wall I knew held the main panel, my footsteps echoing slightly on the bare concrete. Then, as I pivoted to get a better angle, a glint caught my eye. A small reflection off a hinge peeked through a narrow gap between two stacked boxes. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, staring at it. I had lived in this house for years. I had been in this basement countless times. That wall was supposed to be solid, just concrete, unbroken except for the main doorway I used to come down. And yet, there it was, a door I had never noticed before. I felt my chest tighten. I crouched slightly, edging toward the boxes to get a closer look without bumping them over. There was no handle, nothing to grip, but I could see a faint shadow of a seam running around the edges of the door. My hand trembled slightly as I tested the gap, pushing gently with my fingers. The door was stuck at first, but with a little force, I managed to pry it open just enough to slip my hand inside. The air that came out of the opening was hotter than the rest of the basement, stale and thick, with a faint metallic smell I couldn't place. I squinted my flashlight into the opening. Inside was a small room, only about 4 feet by 4 feet, completely empty except for a single chair placed in the center. It looked like an old wooden chair, simple and unremarkable, but the drywall around it told a different story. Scratches marred the walls, uneven and frantic, like someone had tried desperately to claw their way out. The patterns weren't random, they curved and zigzagged, showing a strange, almost desperate rhythm. My skin felt cold despite the sweltering heat, and I had the sudden, sick feeling that someone had been trapped here, maybe for hours, maybe longer. I swallowed hard, feeling my throat dry. The room smelled faintly of mildew, dust, and old sweat, a smell that seemed to cling to the back of my nose. My flashlight shook slightly as I moved it around, illuminating the corners. There was nothing else in the room, no other furniture, no belongings, nothing to indicate why it existed. Just the chair and the marks on the walls. I stepped closer, my sneakers squeaking softly on the concrete floor of the basement, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. I crouched to inspect the scratches more closely. They were deep in some places, as though someone had been pressing their fingernails hard against the drywall, and faint dust had fallen from the grooves. The chair in the middle of the room looked ordinary enough, but its placement, directly in the center, seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. I could see small scuffs on the floor around the chair, like someone had dragged it back and forth repeatedly. There were no signs of nails or screws in the floor, no restraints, nothing else that would explain it. I couldn't make sense of it. Whoever had been here, whoever had left those marks, had left nothing behind but this empty space and the chair. I shined my flashlight across the rest of the room, looking for anything else that might explain the purpose of this space. There were no hooks, no shelves, no hidden compartments. The walls were bare except for the scratches. I moved toward the doorway to take a step back, and that's when I noticed the small stains near the baseboard. Dark smudges, almost like smears of dirt or rust, leading from the far corner to the chair. I bent down to examine them. They weren't fresh, but they were distinct against the pale drywall. My stomach twisted. I realized this room wasn't built for storage. It wasn't a forgotten utility closet. It was meant to hold someone, and whoever had been here had left evidence of their struggle behind. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The heat in the basement pressed against my skin, but my arms and legs were suddenly cold. I forced myself to stand straight, looking around one last time, committing the details to memory. The small, square room, the lone chair in the center, the frantic scratches all around, the faint stains near the chair. I slid the door back into its frame, careful not to make a sound, and pushed the cardboard boxes back into place. The basement felt ordinary again, cluttered and dimly lit by my phone, but I couldn't shake the image of that tiny enclosed space. I climbed the stairs slowly, pausing to make sure I wasn't imagining anything. The air upstairs felt soft in comparison, cooler because of the breeze from the open windows. I wiped my forehead with the back of my hand, trying to shake off the lingering unease. I went to the kitchen and checked the fuse box again, making sure the connections were secure, trying to rationalize what I had seen. There was no logical explanation for the hidden room. The house wasn't that old, and I had been meticulous about inspecting the basement over the years. Whoever built it had created that space intentionally and carefully, concealing it behind walls and boxes. It had clearly been used at some point, and the marks left behind made it impossible to pretend it had been empty forever. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, the heat pressing against me in waves as I tossed and turned in bed, my mind returning again and again to the basement. By morning, the sunlight streaming through the curtains made the house feel ordinary, almost cheerful. I decided to inspect the basement in daylight, to be sure I hadn't imagined it. Sure enough, the boxes shifted when I moved them, revealing the seam of the door. The chair was still there, faded and dusty, and the scratches on the walls were just as sharp as they had been in the dark. I took careful measurements, noted the square dimensions, and studied every detail. There was no question now. That room was real, and someone had been trapped there. I spent the next few days researching, checking old blueprints, city permits, anything that might explain the space. There was nothing. No record of a hidden room in the house, no renovation notes, no mention of the space in any inspection report. It was as though it had been deliberately erased from memory. I decided to remove the chair, clean the walls, and seal the door as best as I could. I wanted to leave it behind, to erase the evidence, but I kept a mental record of everything I had seen. Every scratch, every stain, every scuff on the floor. I told myself I would not investigate further, that some parts of a house's history were better left alone. Weeks later, I could walk past the basement without the same immediate sense of dread. The heat had broken, the lights were working, and the house felt normal again. Yet, whenever I thought about that small, hidden room, my skin would still prick. I knew what it had been used for, I knew what had happened there, and I knew that nothing in the house would ever be truly ordinary again. But I also knew I had made it through, and that knowledge, small, quiet, and stubborn, was enough to bring a kind of uneasy closure. The room was part of the house's past, a secret that had been revealed, examined, and finally contained. I could live with that, and in the end, that was enough. It was past 1 in the morning, and the house was heavy with that thick, almost oppressive stillness that only comes when everyone else is asleep. The kind of silence that makes the small sounds you usually ignore, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant creak of the heating ducts, sound enormous and deliberate. I needed some tools from the basement. The job was simple: tighten a few screws, check a leaky pipe, maybe grab the extra flashlight just in case. Normally, this wouldn't have bothered me, but I had a bad habit of putting off trips to the basement because of the broken light switch. It had been like that for months. The plastic was snapped off, jagged edges sticking out of the wall like teeth, the wires exposed and taped up in a lazy, temporary way. I had meant to fix it for weeks, but never got around to it. I didn't even know why, really. Maybe the basement had always felt a little off to me, though I never had a real reason for it. I grabbed a flashlight, told myself it would be fine, and went down the narrow steps. The smell hit me immediately: damp concrete, old cardboard, faint mold, and the metallic tang of something I couldn't identify. My shoes scuffed on the cold cement, echoing in the space like a loud announcement that I was there. I had the flashlight in one hand, my other hand brushing along the wall, trying to keep steady. Then I noticed the bulb. It was on. Not full brightness, but a slow, wavering glow, like it was breathing. My heart skipped a beat. The switch was still missing. There was no way for the bulb to have turned on by itself. I froze, staring. I thought maybe someone had come home unexpectedly, someone with access to the basement, but no one was supposed to be here. My hands shook slightly as I lifted the flashlight to get a better look. The bulb flickered again, and for a split second, it felt like it was reacting to me specifically, as if it had waited for my presence to decide to light up. I moved forward slowly, unsure whether to turn back. Every instinct screamed to leave, but I needed those tools. My fingers grazed the exposed wires near the switch, and the light suddenly sputtered, brightening sharply for an instant before dying with a loud pop that made me jump back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The echo of the pop lingered in the basement, bouncing off the walls and settling into the corners where the shadows already seemed too thick. I caught my breath and forced myself to look around. The basement was exactly the same as it always had been. Boxes stacked unevenly, old furniture covered in dust sheets, a scattering of tools that had been abandoned months ago. Nothing had moved, yet the memory of the flickering light made me feel like someone had been watching, like my every motion had been mirrored and noted in real time. The idea made my skin crawl. I set the flashlight on a shelf and tried to focus. The tools were in a box at the far end of the basement, under the stairs that led to a tiny crawl space I had always avoided. The light from the flashlight trembled across the walls, catching glimpses of old paint peeling, water stains, and a scattering of spider webs. Every little detail seemed sharper, more pronounced, as if the basement had been waiting for me to notice them. I picked up the box of tools slowly, each movement deliberate, my ears straining for any sound beyond the small scrape of my shoes. I was halfway back to the stairs when I heard it, a soft thump, just beyond the edge of the light. My stomach sank. I froze. The sound was too slow and deliberate to be a box settling or the pipes shifting. It had a rhythm to it, like footsteps, but faint, almost cautious. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was spooked by the earlier flash of the bulb. Still, I gripped the box tighter, my knuckles white, and moved forward. Another thump followed, then a dragging noise that made my heart leap. The sound didn't continue steadily, but appeared sporadically, just enough to make me glance over my shoulder. Every time I did, the shadows seemed to stretch a little farther, darker, denser. Finally, I reached the top of the stairs, my hands slick with sweat despite the chill in the basement. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it, or thought I did. A corner of the room, behind a stack of old cardboard boxes, seemed to shift. My first reaction was disbelief. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation. The boxes had settled, maybe a breeze from the small basement window stirred them. I told myself that over and over. My chest was tight, and I could feel the adrenaline buzzing through my veins. I picked up the pace, taking the stairs 2 at a time. The flashlight bounced in my hand, illuminating the rough cement wall and the occasional pipe. My ears were ringing from the earlier shock of the bulb. Halfway up, I slipped slightly on a patch of damp cement, my box clattering to the floor. Tools spilled, clanging, and the sound was deafening in the otherwise quiet basement. My heart was in my throat. I crouched quickly to gather them, each tool feeling impossibly heavy in my hands. I couldn't shake the sense that something was right behind me, just beyond the reach of the light. The shadows seemed too dark, the air too cold, though the basement had never been uncomfortably chilly before. It was a suffocating feeling, a weight pressing down on my chest. Finally, with the tools back in the box, I ran the last steps and slammed the basement door behind me. My breathing was ragged, my hands still shaking. I leaned against the door, letting my body absorb the relief that I had made it out. I told myself it was all mechanical, flickering wires, a tired bulb, my imagination running wild. Rationally, I knew the basement couldn't have changed overnight. The broken switch and the exposed wires hadn't suddenly become alive, and yet the sensation of being watched hadn't left me. It lingered, the memory of that brief, unnatural light, the sound of the thumps, the shadows stretching further than they should. I didn't go back down that night. I didn't go back for the next few weeks either. Instead, I called an electrician during the day, someone I could trust to check the wiring and the fixture properly. When he arrived, I followed him down the basement, watching every movement. He tested the circuit, checked the connections, replaced the broken switch, and finally replaced the bulb entirely. The basement looked the same, just like it had every day, but this time the light worked without hesitation. It was still hard to shake the memory of that night. The basement didn't feel different, and nothing tangible had happened to prove there was ever a problem beyond the faulty wiring. Yet I felt a strange, lingering unease for days. I started keeping the basement door closed at all times, even during the day, and I made sure my flashlight always had fresh batteries. Gradually, the tightness in my chest eased, and I could walk past the basement without stopping. Months later, I would sometimes think back to that night, the way the bulb had flared when I reached for the switch, the way it had died with that sharp, violent pop. I could rationalize it now: faulty wiring, an electrical surge, maybe even a loose connection that reacted unpredictably. But even so, I could never forget the feeling that had crawled up my spine in that split second, the sensation of being observed, the way my own reactions had felt mirrored and tracked. It was just a basement, just wires and concrete, just shadows and light, but for me it had been enough to leave a mark. I fixed the wiring, I fixed the switch, and the basement became just a basement again. Tools went back in their boxes, the floor was swept, and the walls, patched and cleaned, no longer seemed alive in the dark. Still, I never stayed down there longer than I had to. Even years later, whenever I caught a glimpse of that small corner under the stairs, I felt a shiver, a memory of something that wasn't meant to be explained, and I made sure to turn on the light before I even thought about going near it. I never saw anything again, never heard any noises, and the bulb worked perfectly. The basement returned to normal, but that night, that feeling, stayed with me, a quiet, unshakable reminder that sometimes, even the most ordinary place can feel suddenly impossibly wrong. It was over. The basement was safe. I knew it logically, but I never forgot.